Tonight on DBL, our two-night True Crime Chronicles marathon begins. We are giving you an inside look at some of the most infamous and mysterious true crime cases from across the country. We're going back and exploring the stories you saw right here in DBL. First, we begin with a murder-suicide that rattled Atlanta. DBL's True Crime Chronicles case files starts now. Investigators are stunned. A community is in disbelief. What could cause a happy, prominent mother to take the lives of her own children before taking her own? We are taking a look at a case in Atlanta that is captivating the country in today's DBL's Real Crime Mysteries.
Marsha Edwards was your typical mother. The 58-year-old worked hard and cared deeply about her kids, often posting pictures of them on Instagram as a happy and tight-knit family. Her last post even read, "I could not ask for better children." But that sweet message soon turned cryptic.
Police say a mom in Cobb County killed her son and daughter and then killed herself.
Hours after that post, a murder-suicide. The pieces just didn't add up.
For many of you are wondering what would cause a mother to end the lives of her children, adult children.
The horrific crime quickly captivated news outlets.
Hope Ford joins us live now from Vinings with how the family is being remembered tonight.
11 Alive's Hope Ford closely followed this case and the impact the family left on their community.
Yeah, the family longtime friends of Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, both Aaron and Chris Edwards, worked at the mayor's office. But not only that, the brother and sister were making lasting impacts outside of Atlanta.
The daughter, 20-year-old Erin, was a Boston University journalism student who interned with NBC New York.
She was happy. She was just very excited and very eager to kind of jump into the world of journalism.
The son, 24-year-old Christopher Jr., worked for the mayor's office.
He was just so bright and very bubbly. He definitely was excited the first time I met him, and I'm just stunned.
Marsha's ex-husband and the father, Dr. Christopher Edwards, was a prominent Atlanta area surgeon. He frantically called for a welfare check after his son skipped work. Left stunned and devastated to hear from police, his ex-wife killed their kids before pulling the gun on herself.
We're all in shock and disbelief because it's just unheard of.
What would drive a mother to do this? Some people on social media are second-guessing investigators and say Marsha didn't do it, pointing to no obvious signs of violence or suicide. So if it wasn't the mother, then who killed this prominent Atlanta family? A family with so much to give has left behind so little clues.
Shocking and heartbreaking. We are joined now by our sister station 11 Alive's reporter Hope Ford. Hope, thank you for being here. Now, you've spent the last month covering the case. Bring us up to date. Where does the case stand now?
So as far as we know right now, this case, it's closed with not a whole lot of answers to a lot of the questions that people had.
Wow. Okay, so I really need to hear from you, Hope. What went through your head when you first heard of this horrific crime? Was it just shock? What was it, anger? What was it?
For me, as a journalist hearing about this crime, it was more so immediately wanting to find answers for this community.
Interesting.
This is a prominent family, you know, and a very, very shocking crime. And a lot of people had those what questions.
Yeah.
What could cause any mother to want to kill her children? What happened in that house? What, if anything, could have been done to prevent this from happening? So that's what went through my head immediately, is trying to really answer those questions that everyone had.
Hope,
Al Jackson here. Thank you for joining us. Your input is invaluable. I guess my question is, why do you think people are having a hard time believing investigators that the mother did this, even though it seems like all the evidence is pointing towards her? Is it just disbelief?
It is a little bit of disbelief, and not only that, you don't hear about this type of crime happening too often. Most of the time, when parents are accused of killing their children, the victims are very young, and there's some sort of mental illness there. And so when it's a very rare crime to hear about a mother apparently killing her adult children and then herself. And not only that, you take that and you couple it with the fact that she just got back from vacation. She took her son to Miami, her daughter to Italy, and on the morning of, posted, "I couldn't ask for better children." So people are wondering, how did you go from "I couldn't ask for better children" to apparently killing them and then yourself?
And Hope, this is a tough one because some of your coworkers knew the victims. So how big of an impact has this left on Atlanta?
I mean, a huge impact, especially in the community of journalism as well. It was a lot of grief, a lot of shock. The Edwards children, Chris Jr. and Aaron, not a single person I talked to didn't reiterate the same message. These were two talented people, gifted, and now the world is never going to know what they were capable of. They were both pursuing journalism to some degree, and they were already making impactful and meaningful connections and contributions, not only in Atlanta, but outside of Atlanta at a very young age, 24 and 20. And then you have Marsha Edwards, an accomplished businesswoman who doted on her children and their accomplishments on social media and to other family. So people are just looking at that and they're wondering, how could it have ended like this?
Yeah, Hope, it just doesn't add up. It really doesn't. So tragic. Thank you, Hope. And if you, DBL Nation, if you want to read more on this case, you can check out 11 Alive's coverage and reporting at 11alive.com. We will be right back.
Welcome back to DBL. What happened to Theresa Holopa? That question has left investigators in Minnesota stumped for nearly 4 decades. Now, thanks to her high school reunion, investigators are taking another crack at the case. We have a look in today's DBL's Real Crime Mysteries.
Theresa Holopa grew up in Tower, Minnesota, a tiny northwestern town with less than 500 people, where everyone felt like family.
It's her graduation picture.
It was June 1979. Theresa had just graduated high school and was getting ready for a new adventure, joining the Army.
We were like, what?
Her last day in town, she left a family event early to go pack.
When Theresa said she had to go, I told her to wait.
But her brother was too late.
By the time I got outside, she was already up the block. And that's the last I seen her.
10 agonizing days went by, but there was no sign of his sister. And then, police made a gruesome discovery. Theresa Holopa's body was found in the woods, beaten to death.
Why? Why would someone do this?
For an entire year, investigators had no leads. But then a suspect was identified. It was one of Theresa's classmates. But that small sense of closure lasted only seconds.
They basically said that their prime suspect had taken his own life and that the case was going to be closed. I didn't feel they were giving us all the information.
Why didn't investigators arrest him sooner?
Was he the prime suspect? If he was, then why the hell wasn't he in jail?
An investigation by KARE 11's reporter Danny Spiewak prompted investigators to talk.
Why wasn't that person arrested at the time?
That person was interviewed, and I believe evidence was being gathered, was going to possibly a grand jury at that point in time.
So this case was very close to being closed?
That's what my understanding from reading the reports, yes.
Investigators believe the suspect took his own life after sexually assaulting a young girl. Theresa's case was suspended, but it was never classified as solved.
And nobody had looked at this investigation in about 38 years.
That all changed this summer at a 40th year high school reunion, when Theresa's classmates started asking questions. That prompted investigators to look at old evidence using new DNA technology. they think they have a good chance of finding something.
Using the technology that we now have that didn't exist back in 1979.
This is now the second oldest active investigation in St. Louis County.
I could use some closure. Is the pain going to go away?
So what happened to Theresa Holopa?
Joined now by our sister station CARES reporter, Danny Spiewak. Danny, thank you so much for being here. I want to just really commend you. You are the only reporter to cover this case in Minnesota. Danny, are there any new leads since you broke the story?
Nothing yet. We haven't heard anything from the police department or the sheriff's office, but we have gotten a lot of emails and calls into our newsroom after running this story, which is a good sign because it renewed some interest not only in northern Minnesota, but also here in the Twin Cities metro as well.
That's very true.
Hey, Danny, we just watched the package, and we just kind of want to know, what were people saying at that high school reunion that grabbed so much attention from police?
You know, it really started several months ago in the planning stages for the reunion as this 40th reunion was coming up. A lot of the classmates, I think just some of those feelings started to boil up from 4 decades ago, and they wanted an official closed case here. They wanted to know what happened to Theresa because it was so traumatic 40 years ago, just days after graduation, to lose one of their classmates in a brutal murder. They just wanted to know exactly what happened. They wanted an answer, and they decided that maybe the reunion was the way to get the attention of law enforcement, which it turned out it was.
Good for them.
And this is such an interesting case. Theresa's family members told you they feel that other people are also responsible for her death. Why do you think they feel that way?
I think they just think that it would be implausible for one person to commit the crime. It seemed in my conversations with them that they do believe that the suspect that was identified by law enforcement was indeed the person that committed the crime, but they just think that that person would have needed more help. They just don't think that that person would have been able to do it all alone.
What kind of new technology would investigators be using to help find DNA evidence? And Danny, be honest, do you think that it'll work?
You know, I think that it might, because in a lot of these old cases, they have DNA that was lying around, but back in 1979, they didn't know how to use it. They kept it thinking that maybe someday they'd be able to test it, and now they can do that. So if they do have any type of evidence from the crime scene still around, then I think it may give them a positive match on the suspect that they've identified. So it will be really interesting to just see what happens from here.
Thank you, Danny. And honestly, give yourself a pat on the back because you might give closure to a tremendous amount of people. You should be really proud of yourself. If you want to read more on the case, you can check out CARE's coverage at care11.com. Thanks again, Danny. Really great job.
Thank you, Danny.
Thank you.
Nearly 2 years have gone by and still no answers in the Maggie Long murder case. The mystery has captivated so many people. It's now the most listened to episode on Tegna's True Crime Chronicles podcast. Here's an update on the case in this DBL's Real Crime Mysteries.
Maggie Long grew up in Bailey, a small Colorado town just 50 miles west of Denver. The teen was passionate about life, theater, and volunteering.
She was a smart, beautiful 17-year-old girl who was in charge of the VIP section for the concert at our high school on Friday night, December 1st, 2017.
That night, she left the concert to run home and grab cookies and water for the audience, telling her friends, "I'll be right back." Maggie was never seen again. That same night, a 911 call comes in reporting a fire at Maggie's family home. Her body was found burned inside, but the public had no idea because of a gag order.
It was very frustrating, and it made a lot of people angry that there was nothing ever said. You know, there was no updates.
2 agonizing months went by until former Park County Sheriff Fred Wagner finally held a press conference.
It is apparent that a burglary had occurred and the house was set on fire.
The public learned that guns, ammunition, and valuables were stolen from Maggie's home that night, but were told not to worry.
We are very confident that there is no threat out there right now to anybody else.
The media quickly caught on.
Sheriff Wagner held one press conference on the Maggie Long case, insisting to reporters there was no public threat. He decided to end his term in Florida, fishing, mostly handling the job through email.
Sheriff Tom McGraw took over in January 2019 and made Maggie's case his top priority, and the public's too.
It saddens me greatly to tell you that Maggie was purposely set on fire and burned alive. We believe this was a targeted crime and that there were at least 3 suspects still at large.
For the first time, we see images of the burned home and sketches of the 3 suspects and their cars spotted leaving the property.
They deliberately chose to take her life.
2 years later, finally some information, but no arrests. Who are these 3 suspects, and why would they kill Maggie?
Most, if not 90% of crimes are solved by a citizen. A tip, a lead, which just leads detectives to another tip, another lead.
Billboards plastered throughout Colorado plead for the public's help. Who killed Maggie Long?
Horrific. We're joined now by Noel Brennan, reporter from our sister station, 9 News in Denver. Noel, you've been covering this case since it broke, and right now there is a $50,000 reward for any new leads. Are there any new leads? Are we going to catch these people?
Well, the short answer with the leads is no. I mean, the last press conference we had was January of this year, and that's when they released those 3 suspect sketches, and that's really the latest piece of information that we have. These 3 guys that spent a long time in the house with Maggie and were involved in her death.
Well, that leads me to my question. You were at that press conference and you asked the sheriff what the heck took him so long to come out with this. Did his answer satisfy you?
So there were 2 press conferences. I think you're referring to the first one, which was 2 months after Maggie was murdered. So
2 months?
2 months, yeah. So she was killed December 1st, 2017. The first press conference wasn't until February.
As a parent, I would be seeing red. It's unacceptable.
Yeah, so the sheriff at the time said it just had to do with all the information, they had so much information coming out in the case that they were processing.
Or was he just fishing? Yeah. I mean, that just really angers me.
Sure.
Now we have these new leads on the suspects' faces, the sketches. Do you think that will help? And how did we get these sketches? How did people find these trucks that were just missed before?
So we don't know who provided those sketches to police. There was a tenant.
We don't even know.
There was a guy who was renting a place inside the house who was also in the home when the fire happened and when Maggie was killed. We don't know who this person is. His name hasn't been released. And so we're assuming maybe he was the one that provided the descriptions of those 3 men.
Wow. So your reporting was featured on Tegna's True Chronicles or True Crime Chronicles podcast, and it is the most listened to podcast. Why? And we've covered some of the cases, and I continue to delve into many of the cases. Why is this case so fascinating to the listeners, do you think?
I think it comes down to Maggie and the awful way in which she died. I think that gets a lot of people's attention. I think it was the slow release of information in the case.
The upset, the unjust.
Absolutely. But really, Maggie, I mean, she was this girl that was beloved in this community. In the piece that you shared, I mean, she was involved in so many different things in her high school. She did theater. She was on the softball team. She was 2 weeks shy of her 18th birthday when she was killed. And what she planned to do on her 18th birthday, she wanted to pass out sandwiches, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to the homeless.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So how do we honor her? How do we make sure that her name lives on?
I think keep talking about her. Keep talking about this case. The fact that we're talking about it today, I think, is helpful. This community is not going to forget her because she is so beloved there. But keep the pressure on investigators to keep this a priority.
Thank you, Noel. We need to get these people caught. We really do. So please, anybody seen anything, report it. She deserves justice. Absolutely. Thank you, Noel. If you want to read more on this case or listen to the podcast, go to 9news.com.
A cold case out of Cleveland from the 1980s is on the verge of a breakthrough thanks to a new type of DNA testing. We're taking a look at the case of Barbara Bartnick in DBL's True Crime Chronicles.
Barbara Bartnick's murder has captivated the Cleveland area for decades. The 17-year-old was a popular student at Erie View Catholic High School.
She just turned 17. She was just a kid.
It was Christmas, 1987. Barbara spent her last night alive at a party. She left with friends who brought her home and never saw her again. The next morning, Tragedy shook the town. Oil and gas workers found Barbara's body in the woods, miles from her home.
Whoever killed her beat her to death.
Barbara was beaten and raped. She was found naked with only her class ring left on her finger.
I always just thought we were just going to be one of those families that never knew because there was not enough evidence or samples. And unless somebody said, yeah, I did it.
Investigators held on to her class ring and a small sample of DNA under Barbara's fingernail for years.
Luckily, they have held on to this DNA that was underneath her fingernails that she probably got when fighting her killer.
Now, a new nonprofit called Porchlight is now taking on the case, paying $4,000 to conduct private DNA testing.
I think our chances are really good with solving this case. I think it'll happen sooner than later.
It's not your typical DNA tests we see at police departments. The nonprofit is looking at genetic DNA. It's the same type of testing used to identify Joseph DeAngelo, known as the Golden State Killer. The serial killer and rapist was caught last year after decades of crime, thanks to genealogy testing. Barbara's family believes this new DNA testing could help track down the person responsible for killing her.
And earlier today, we spoke with journalists at our sister station, WKYC in Cleveland, to get a deeper look at the case.
We are joined now by investigative reporter Drew Horansky and investigative producer Phil Trexler from our sister station, WKYC in Cleveland. Now, this story, I mean, for all of us, it gives you goosebumps, especially as parents. 17 years old. I just pray that the family gets justice. You both have been covering this case for months. Any updates?
Well, I'd say the latest update is that the unique group, nonprofit Porchlight, has come up with some DNA profile that is now currently being tested. They did some fundraising, they got the money, and it's currently being tested. And in fact, they've even come up with a partial profile that have yet to be released because of the ongoing investigation. But there is movement forward.
Well, that kind of leads me to my next question. Because there's so many cases, why did the nonprofit Porchlight decide to pick up this case?
Well, for one thing, it's very expensive to do, as much as $4,000 to $5,000 to do this DNA testing. But another thing that we learned is that a lot of departments can look certainly in their own databases, but they would only be limited to people already in that database, people who are likely convicted of a crime. What this allows them to do is to look outside of that database to people who have not been convicted, people who have submitted to genealogy sites.
Wow.
Certainly widens the net, casts it out much bigger than they would if they just looked internally within their own department.
Wow.
Why did it take a nonprofit to make this happen? So, why can't suburban Cleveland police do the DNA testing on their own?
Good question.
That is.
Yeah, there's some issues there with the current genealogy community and law enforcement. They're trying to set up the new rules. Of course, there were some very high-profile cases last year and over the years that they have solved and resolved. But the disconnect is there. So I think it's better now that a private nonprofit works with the genealogy community to do the testing and keep law enforcement to the side. It's what everybody's comfortable now until the new rules are really set in stone.
And sadly, a lot of these cold cases get overlooked as well. Departments have fresher cases to be working on. And, you know, we've seen in a number of cases that these, over time, they are sort of out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, and Drew and Phil, this is the same testing used to track down the Golden State Killer. Do you feel it will bring the same success to this case? And how soon can we expect results?
It certainly has the potential to. The family's hoping, and Porchlight is hoping, that perhaps by Christmas time they could have a full DNA profile. Keep in mind, in this case, what Barbara was able to do was to scrape. She used her nails to defend herself against her attacker, and apparently that is a very good bit of DNA to get. It gives a stronger profile. So the hope is that certainly sooner rather than later, with the money that has been ponied up, that can help expedite this a little bit. The hope is that by Christmas time, and again, as Phil had mentioned, they already have a sense of ethnicity and who this person may be.
Wow, one step closer, one step closer. We pray that they get the justice. Thank you, Drew and Phil. And DBL Nation, if you want to read more on this case, go to WKYC.com. Welcome back to DBL. The disappearance of Jennifer Kessey has captivated the country for the past decade. She vanished from her Florida home, and the one clue left behind has investigators baffled. Now, 13 years later, where does this notorious case stand? We're taking a look in DBL's True Crime Chronicles.
Jennifer Kessey had a contagious spirit.
And I have been asked. Her hugs, she gave the best hugs.
That young girl grew up to become a successful 24-year-old, working as a finance manager in Central Florida. But on January 24th, 2006, Jennifer never showed up for work.
For the first time since she was 15 years old, and we gave her her phone when she got her car, she didn't pick the phone up, and it didn't go 4 rings to voicemail. It went directly to voicemail, and we knew that second
that something was wrong.
Drew and his wife Joyce rushed to Jennifer's condo in Orlando. A wet shower and clothes folded on the bed left subtle clues she had been home earlier. But Jennifer and her car were nowhere to be found.
I'm going to divide everybody up into 3 groups.
Police and the community desperately searched.
We've been looking for this young lady. You see anybody looking like that?
2 days later, Jennifer's car, a black Chevy Malibu, was spotted at a nearby apartment complex. Luckily, a surveillance camera caught a glimpse.
Someone sat in it for 32 seconds, presumably wiped it down from what we know of what we took from the car now, and walked away, never looked back.
The camera flashed every 3 seconds. Unbelievably, the suspect's face was blocked in every single photo.
Luckiest person in the world, if you ask me.
Police even enlisted NASA's help to enhance the grainy image, but no luck.
Do I think we'd ever be here a year later? Absolutely not.
But now, 13 years later, the Kessey family is still living this nightmare.
Every day is Groundhog Day because it's the same day. The same day.
Call it a mother's intuition. Jennifer's mother believes that nearby construction workers were involved.
Jen had shared with quite a few people that the workers made her feel uneasy.
The problem, most of the workers didn't speak English, so investigators never interviewed them. And then they disappeared from the work site.
Was she trafficked? Was she trafficked?
Her family fears the worst.
They take women to rape them, to use them, abuse them, and then kill them if they don't want them anymore. That's why women get taken, period.
Alive or dead, her parents just want an answer.
If you give us this of her, that much of her, then we know. Then we deal with what we have to deal with. But until we get to that point, every single second of every single day, to us, is frantic.
While they desperately search for clues in their daughter's disappearance, they know they can't do it alone.
If that person is listening, that has to eat at you. Yeah. It just, I mean, it's human nature. It's got to. And you know what? Someday, someone's going to come forward.
We pray they do. Earlier this morning, Al, Tori, and I spoke with an expert reporter who spent 13 years covering this case. Take a look. Well, we are joined now by reporter Bo Zimmer from our sister station, WTSP, in Tampa, Florida. Bo, you have covered this case since it broke back in 2006. Now, a lot of us are praying, hoping, and of course, including the family, that there are some new leads. Are there any new leads?
Well, here we are, nearly 14 years later. The tips continue rolling in, but we are not much closer to finding Jennifer than we were that first week when they discovered her car. There, as I said, tips that continue to roll in, but simply we do not have a suspect in this case. And Jennifer, we have no idea where she is. She simply disappeared.
Wow.
Oh. There are a lot of theories in this case, but the parents believe the construction workers were involved. In your 13 years of covering this, which makes you an expert, what do you think happened?
You know, Jennifer was a beautiful young lady in the prime of her life. Her father puts it this way, you know, women are taken for one reason. They're taken to be raped, they're taken to be used, and when they're done being used, they kill them. That's the way he puts it. He's obviously upset speaking and talking about that, but that's what he believes. They know that there are cases where women are out there where they've been held captive for many, many years. They are praying that may be the case and that Jennifer is that next miracle, but they have accepted that this could go either way. But they just need an answer.
Of course. Now, speaking of Jennifer's parents, they recently sued Orlando police to release all 14,000 pages of the investigation. I want to know why they sued and why do they want to go independently on this?
It's not that they don't want the Orlando Police Department to investigate. They just felt after all of these years had gone by, the Orlando police detectives were not putting the effort needed into solving this case.
And Bo, as a parent, believe me, I don't blame these parents, and I really do pray that justice comes in some way, shape, or form. Now, the story was featured on Tegna's True Crime Chronicles podcast this week. It continues to draw people in. So in your opinion, since you've been covering this since 2006, why do you think that people are so fascinated with Jennifer's story? There's a lot of cold cases out there. Why this one?
This one just has so much mystery. The video, the surveillance video that exists in this case, where you see this shadowy figure walking along the fence line, and the video takes an image every 3 frames or so. And as that person walks along, their face is blocked by the fence post in every single shot. We never see that person's face. It is just such a mystery. Jennifer vanished without a trace. People have been hoping and praying for her family all of these years, and they want an answer as well.
Well, I hope we get an answer. I really do. We thank you, Bo. If you want to read more on this case, DBL Nation, go to WTSP.com. And to listen to the podcast, search True Crime Chronicles on Spotify, Apple, or Google streaming services. Thank you, Bo. We will be right back. Back to DBL, a Halloween horror story that you would only see on the big screen came true for a Texas family. Felicia Ruiz was lured to a fake Halloween party only to be attacked and killed. 20 years later, we have a look at the case in DBL's True Crime Chronicles.
Just 17 years old, Felicia Ruiz had her whole life ahead of her.
She was a good student. She was always home on time.
It was October 1999. Felicia was approached by one of the largest and oldest Hispanic street gangs.
She just flat told us they were trying to get her to join the Latin Kings.
In fear, her parents pulled her out of high school. However, Felicia still kept in touch with her friends and was invited to a Halloween party.
You could see she was kind of excited, and when she finally laid it out. She says, "Dad, can I go to a party?"
Her protective parents were hesitant, but they said yes, a decision that will later haunt them.
She said, "I love you, Mom." And I said, "I love you too, Mommy." And she got in the car and drove off into the night, and that was the last time we saw her alive.
An open field near a vacant lot, perfect for a Halloween party. But when Felicia got here, there was no party. It was all part of a sick plan.
Felicia was attacked by 3 people and stabbed to death.
I mean, I can't imagine her laying out here that long. Nobody to help her. And she laid there, and I don't know, they said it took like 7 minutes for her to bleed out.
Police caught 2 of the 3 suspects, Jay Farrell and Lisa Huerta. They're in jail, but pin the blame on Jesus Salazar. Jesus was Lisa's boyfriend at the time. Felicia's mom believes it was jealousy that led to her daughter's death.
She told Jesus, "If you love me, you'll prove it by killing her."
The killing was brutal.
If you cut something from the throat, they stop bleeding constantly to the dead.
Police know Jesus is responsible, but can't find him.
I can tell you where he isn't, and he's not in the United States. We're actively tracking him. It's a continued ongoing investigation.
Police believe he escaped to his hometown in Venezuela.
It's not fair that he lived here and he murders an American girl, and then he goes back to Venezuela and gets protected.
20 years later, her family isn't giving up.
He's going to get caught, so he better start looking over his shoulder because justice is coming.
And earlier this morning, Tori, Al, and I spoke with an investigative reporter who covered this case. Take a look. We are joined now by reporter Grace White at our sister station, KHOU in Houston. So, Grace, a very disturbing case. 20 years later, are police any closer to finding the main suspect, Jesus?
You know, they have gotten several tips. One came in a few years ago in the form of a picture that surfaced on social media. It had Jesus Salazar front and center. He was smiling, holding a beer in his hand. And again, it came from social media. Investigators have said throughout their work on this case, they had two jobs. One was to locate him, one was to arrest him. So they feel like that picture, they've been able to locate him. And certainly now they're working to arrest him and bring this family justice.
That kind of leads to my next question, and I guess maybe you kind of answered it. How did the police find out that he's in Venezuela? And just, I can't imagine, but how do the parents feel about all of this?
It's so incredibly difficult. Venezuela is Jesus Salazar's home country, so investigators believe he has a network of friends and family there that can support him. They do know that years ago, after this all happened in 1999, that his father flew from Venezuela to pick Jesus up in Miami and fly him back to that country. So they believed that he was there all along. But then again, a few years ago, when this picture surfaced on social media, they were able to track him, and they tell us they're still tracking him actively now.
Wow.
Wow. Well, this story was featured on Tegna's True Crime Chronicles podcast this week. I want to know, we all know why it's important to keep this story alive. What are some good ways to do so? Social media, podcasts, what do you think, Grace?
Yeah, I think this mom is really my inspiration. She's never given up hope and fighting for justice for her daughter. She continues to talk to reporters across the country. And I think social media, knowing that tip a few years ago, the biggest break in the case came from a viewer, came from social media. Wow. I think that is the biggest thing we can all do. And I'll never forget what this mom told me. She said, Grace, this was the last thing I said to my daughter before she closed the casket at her funeral. She said, I promised her I would find justice and find the people who did this to my daughter.
Wow, Grace, I have chills. That statement is every parent's worst nightmare, and she too is my inspiration, and we pray that she gets justice. Thank you so much, Grace. If you want to read more on this case, go to khou.com, and to listen to the podcast, search True Crime Chronicles on the Stitcher app or your favorite podcast player. Kaylee Sawyer was brutally killed in Oregon 3 years ago. Her murderer went on to terrorize more victims in a multi-state crime spree. So for the first time, those victims are speaking out in a new podcast called Urge to Kill by our sister station KGW in Portland. We have an exclusive look in DBL's True Crime Chronicles.
Kaylee Sawyer grew up in Bend, Oregon, surrounded by a big, loving family.
She was the first grandchild.
The 23-year-old was working as a dental assistant, studying at Central Oregon Community College to become a dentist.
She had such a big, happy personality, always smiling.
It was a Saturday night, July 2016. Kaylee was out drinking with friends at a bachelorette party. She texts her boyfriend Cameron to pick her up. They arrive at their apartment near campus and get into an argument. Kaylee takes a walk to cool off and is never seen again.
And I've covered countless cases about missing people, kidnappings, and murders. But Kaylee's story is one that still haunts me.
Investigative reporter Ashley Korslin is uncovering new details and never-before-heard interviews in the podcast Urge to Kill. The podcast documents the frantic search for Kaylee.
Dispatch, how can I help you? Last night I got home from the bars with my girlfriend. She got upset at me and ran off.
I really thought that it was just a bad date, bad night, because she'd been out with some friends.
But then her phone would just go straight to voicemail, over and over and over.
They would later learn Kaylee was approached by someone on campus.
It's one of the college's public safety cars, and inside is a public safety officer who's on shift patrolling campus.
Instead of helping Kaylee, he attacks and rapes her.
The safety officer pulls over and gets out, opens the back door, and chokes Kaylee again.
Edwin Lara kills Kaylee using a rock and disposes her body in a canyon off a highway. The day after, he goes on a multi-state crime spree, kidnapping a woman, shooting a man, and carjacking a family until he was caught.
In the end, her killer's only explanation was that he had an urge to kill.
So many victims, but why?
They may never get answers or closure, but for the first time, every one of them is ready to publicly share their story. And it begins here.
Special, can I help you? Yes, I need to have an officer call me. My daughter is missing.
Earlier this morning, Tori Al and I spoke with the host of the podcast to get a sneak peek of the first episode. We're joined by reporter and host of the Urge to Kill podcast, Ashley Corsland from our sister station KGW in Portland. Now, Ashley, you mentioned Kaylee's story still haunts you. I mean, you think about all the bachelorette parties that we've all been to. It seems like it could happen to any one of us. What made you want to produce an entire podcast on this?
I think there was just something about her story. There was so much that I wanted to learn and so much that really wasn't covered in the news. Part of our purpose here is really to tell people about Kaylee and who she was, this beautiful young woman taken too soon. Another thing is that people to this day still think her death was an accident, and that's because some of the early information that was put out based on what her killer had told his wife and police at the time, which was not true, but that information got out through the media, and so to this day people don't know that she was killed intentionally. Another reason we focused on this case was because her killer had other victims across several states, and we really haven't heard from some of them before. So this is the first time that several of them are sharing their story, and it's really powerful.
Ashley, Edwin Lara pled guilty. He is serving a life sentence. Now, his only explanation was that he had, quote, an urge to kill. I watch a lot of true crime and I listen to a lot of podcasts. I gotta ask, did police ever find another motive? And have you ever seen this motive as just the urge to kill in any other case?
I've never heard that. That was one of the most startling things about this case that really compelled us to look into it. You know, he had told police in this 6-hour interrogation after his arrest, he gave him several stories, right? So he said it was an accident, I hit her with the car. Then he moved on to saying that he assumed she was a prostitute and that all he tried to do was rob her. So he went through several stories before police got it out of him, and he said, I've had an urge to kill for as long as I can remember. And something, it's crazy, and something that we looked into is he actually told police he had planned a murder in the past. So they took that statement very seriously, and you know, they found a presentation on serial killers in his shed that he kept from college, because they firmly believe that he could have been or would have become a serial killer.
How has Kaylee's story changed how security and safety on college campuses is handled?
Yeah, so Al, that's kind of the bright light that came of this tragic story is her family went on to push for what's now known as Kaylee's Law in Oregon. And so Kaylee's Law essentially mandates steps that campus police officers or college safety guards can't look like police officers. So uniforms, equipment, cars, that sort of thing. And then it also mandates very strict national background checks and psychological tests for any of these future college safety guards. So that's really the what's come out of this. That has been a big deal for the state of Oregon.
Yeah, that's a very important protocol. Thank you so much, Ashley. The first episode is out now.
Guys.
If you want to listen, head to kgw.com. To DBL. Hidden in this small town of Florence, Colorado, is a place so secluded and secure, it is considered the Alcatraz of the Rockies. ADX Florence is the highest security prison in the world, housing the most dangerous criminals. So we have a look at the Supermax in this special edition of DBL's True Crime Chronicles.
Lingering in the shadows of Colorado's Rocky Mountains lies the country's only federal Supermax prison. ADX Florence is closed off to the rest of the world. On the outside, armed security guards, gun towers, and cameras. On the inside, pure isolation. Inmates spend an average of 23 hours a day in a 7 by 12 foot concrete cell with a bed, desk, toilet, sink, and shower. Meals are slid through a small hole in the door. The only glimpse of the outside world is a tiny window. This prison was specifically designed to keep every inmate in solitary confinement. No one has escaped since it opened in 1994. The Supermax incarcerates criminals deemed too dangerous for the average prison, like the notorious drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, who was transferred in July after escaping 2 prisons in Mexico. Boston Marathon bomber Johar Tsarnaev, Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, and Oklahoma City bomber Terry Nichols are also incarcerated here. Of the 400 inmates, 1 was considered the most dangerous: Terrible Tommy Silverstein. He killed 3 inmates and a prison guard in jail before being transferred to the Supermax. Tommy spent more than 3 decades in solitary confinement before dying this year. The few who have been inside and made it out call the Supermax life after death. Others say it's a clean version of hell.
Wow. We are joined now by Alan Prendergast, a senior reporter at Westward Magazine in Denver. Thank you for joining us. I can't imagine even stepping foot in that facility. Now, you've spent the past 30 years writing on high security prisons and historic crimes, and you were also one of the last reporters allowed at this Supermax prison. So everyone wants to know, what was it like inside? What's a typical day like? Please tell us.
It's a very disorienting experience. You go through a maze of locks, doors, sally ports, surveillance. The staff are in these control rooms with these panels of lights, sort of like the Starship Enterprise, and they're controlling remotely what's going on and intensely monitoring what is happening with the inmates, who are mostly just in their cells.
They never interact, ever. These would Ted Kaczynski interact with El Chapo ever?
The only way that would probably happen is during a recreation period, if they were both in different cages on the yard.
Near each other.
But most of the real high-profile ones tend to be even more isolated, so that they may not be allowed on the yard. Someone like Silverstein wouldn't have been allowed on the yard with other inmates. He would have been alone doing that. So,
chilling.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of that, you've written a lot about isolation cells, and actually read an article that said that because they've been in there for 23 hours a day, they start to see things. And you've, I don't want to put words in your mouth. You said that it's almost like, what's the word I'm looking for? Torture. Mm-hmm. Do you think that this would kind of violate our United States anti-torture laws because of like what they're being subjected to, even though there are despicable people?
Right. Well, there is a serious issue there. International rights organizations do consider that degree of isolation to be torture. I mean, it is debilitating. We have studies that show people that are isolated like that, they become very sensitive to noise and light. They sometimes become paranoid. They do hallucinate sometimes. If they already have some mental illness, and a lot of inmates do, it can be exacerbated by that. There are instances of suicide, mutilation, things like that. And yes, it's a problem because on one hand, we do want to keep these people isolated because they are extremely dangerous, some of them. But at what point does that become not a good thing? I mean, at state level, a lot of prisons are rethinking solitary because if these people are going to get out someday, they've been very damaged by this. And some people in ADX, the Supermax, do get released at some point down the line. So you have to think about that in terms of public safety as well as whether you're being humane.
We just learned about Terrible Tommy Silverstein, which a lot of people might not know about, and you wrote back and forth with him. You never interviewed him in person. Did he ever have any regrets at the end of his life? He just passed away this past year, I believe.
Yeah, he did. He was actually a very interesting guy. I mean, he's one of the reasons ADX was built, because these murders took place at another high security prison, but the security wasn't adequate enough to keep him further isolated. He particularly regretted he murdered a correctional officer at that prison. And over the years, he did really have, I think, a change of heart about some of the things that he did when he was an Aryan Brotherhood leader and thought was following the convicts specific code about these things. But
you
yes,
wrote
he was
back and forth with him.
Oh yes, no, we corresponded for years. He was a very thoughtful guy. I mean, he had done a lot of thinking and a lot of contemplation over the years. He was probably the most isolated prisoner in America for much of his career. And you know, if you want to talk about torture, he was certainly in position to do that, but he didn't seem to lose his marbles when he was in there.
Unbelievable.
I just have a quick thing, please, because we interview some of these people and kind of give them a voice, I'd rather give someone like that a voice to say, I was president of the Aryan Brotherhood. It's not worth going down this path. I have regrets. My life's almost coming to an end. I'd rather have those type of things get out there than, why did you do this? And let me get into your mind a little bit more and almost push them up.
You want people to learn from
I'd rather you get those letters that he wrote to you at the end of his life out there.
Well, you know, it's an interesting thing. I mean, there are all kinds of people in these places, and some of them are, you know, by any social standards, really bad people. But I think you can learn a lot from people who have been through some of these experiences. Sometimes they've had an opportunity to look at a side of life that most of us just don't experience.
Wow, fascinating stuff.
Very
Thank you so much, Alan, for being here. You can read Alan's reporting on high-profile crimes and prisons at westword.com. Ted Bundy, one of the world's most notorious serial killers, is being linked to a decades-old cold case. Anne Marie Burr vanished in 1961, but could she be Ted Bundy's first victim? We have a look at the startling discovery in DBL's True Crime Chronicles.
Anne Marie Burr was a young, radiant girl living in Tacoma, Washington.
Anne Marie Burr managed to capture the love and admiration of family, friends, even strangers she never met.
At just 8 years old, she vanished from her home.
They never found anything, not a thing, not a trail, not a speck of anything.
Sandy Holt grew up in Tacoma and knew Anne Marie, as well as Ted Bundy.
He always lied. I mean, always.
Bundy, one of the most notorious serial killers and rapists, lived just blocks from Anne at the time of her disappearance. He was 14 and had played with Anne as a kid.
Horrible. There's no other way to explain him. He didn't fit in anywhere.
Could Anne Marie Burr be Ted Bundy's first victim? Police say evidence collected at Anne's house here so many years ago is limited because of methods investigators used back then. But King 5 News has learned that recently police have sent some of that evidence to the lab to be tested, hoping new technology can finally help solve this case.
King 5 News' Greg Copeland spoke with true crime author Rebecca Morris, who's been investigating the Anne Marie Burr and Ted Bundy link for years.
In 1986, Ted had told this story about this hypothetical first crime of his, of murdering a child.
Especially he told that story to a serial killer researcher in a prison interview.
He told the story about this early crime of taking a child out of her house, taking her to the orchard next door, and molesting her, and then leaving her in a ditch.
Anne's family lived next to the University of Puget Sound campus, where several buildings were under construction at the time.
Anne's father went back to the house and told the police, "You've got to go up there and look at those construction sites because there are all these ditches." And in fact, he and his brother had seen a teenager standing at one of the ditches and kind of kicking the dirt in with his feet.
By the time police went back, everything was paved over.
Ted Bundy was executed at 4:16 Seattle time.
Bundy was executed in 1989. He eventually confessed to at least 30 victims.
I just knew that he was the one that got rid of her somewhere.
Although he's now dead, 25 years later, a crack at new technology could bring closure to the Burr family.
What a horrific person. Earlier on DBL, Jeff Lindsay and I spoke with the reporter who helped cover this Tacoma cold case. We are joined by anchor and reporter Greg Copeland from our sister station, King 5 News in Seattle. So, Greg, you and producer Tess Wagner investigated this, and we want to know what prompted Tacoma police to reopen Ann's case, and how long will this testing take?
We don't know at this point. And think about it was a cold case. So basically, they shelve these cases that they can't solve, and usually they will come back to them when they either have some new evidence or a new way to test that evidence. But at this point, Tacoma police are being fairly tight-lipped about exactly what led to them retesting this evidence.
Greg, I have so many questions, but Ann's parents are no longer alive, but you spoke to her brother who was just 5 years old at the time. What does he think of all this?
He's at peace with us. Obviously, when you have a tragedy like this, you're going to compartmentalize, and he's found a way to make peace with us, knowing that she is in heaven with their parents. So I can't help but think that if they were able to connect all the dots here and provide some closure, if they can figure out exactly that Bundy was responsible for this, you know, just to be able to close that case.
And Ann's mom wrote Ted in jail asking if he killed her daughter. He denied it, and you had a chance to look at those letters. Was there anything else that he wrote that you found shocking?
Boy, those letters, in both of them, they're fascinating to go through because we know so much about Bundy, but there's so much we don't know. And the way he even signed his letters, you know, Peace, Ted, was eerie enough. The last letter that I was reading was one that she had written in '86, right after pretty much he had exhausted every effort to his stay of executions, and they had moved it up, and she had written him in between those two, basically pleading, like, listen, we know what you told investigators, please, and she wrote in detail about that night her daughter disappeared and how he might have gotten in there based on a story he had told a serial killer researcher, and she basically threw that right back at him and saying, please, you gave up all these details, you're going to be executed, please, before you are, let us know. And as we know, he really denied all of the murders up until the very end, right before he was to be executed, admitted 30 that we know of.
Right.
And there are some questions as to whether there are more. I mean, he talked and hinted at a couple before the first known murder that he admitted to in 1974, hinted at one in 72, another one in 73, but this would go back even further if they were to link to Burr to 1961 when he was just 14 years old.
Being a mother myself, I can't even imagine her just like begging to get some sort of closure from him. I hope that they find the truth. I hope that they find justice. I mean, it's just absolutely heartbreaking. So thank you so much. To read more on this case, go to king5.com. Missy Beaver's murder case has captivated North Texas for years. The mother and wife was mysteriously killed inside a church after thousands of tips. Are police any closer to catching her killer? Well, we have an update in DBL's True Crime Chronicles.
Missy Beavers was a beloved wife and mother of 3 living in Red Oak, Texas.
My wife was she was a great woman, a great a wife, a great mother, a great friend.
The 45-year-old was a fitness instructor at Creekside Church of Christ in Midlothian, Texas. On April 18, 2016, Missy was scheduled to lead an early morning class. But when her class showed up, they found her body. Missy had been murdered inside the church. According to authorities, the person in this surveillance video is the killer.
I asked everybody out there to review the video. The person has a very distinct walk.
The suspect, wearing police tactical gear, is seen walking through the church the morning Missy was murdered.
There's a lot of split opinions on this case, whether she was targeted or not, whether it was random. Some people see a woman in that video, some people see a man.
Missy died from a head injury, but police won't say what weapon was used.
It's a vital piece of information in this case that we want to protect until we have an opportunity to confront the killer with it.
Missy's brutal murder made national headlines.
The people who showed up for that workout discovered her body instead.
And continues to shock the tiny town in North Texas.
The hardest part for us is just the acknowledgement and not knowing. You know?
Missy had no known enemies, leaving her family and friends baffled.
You have sad moments, you have angry moments, you have moments of where you're up here because you remember all the amazing things that she did and she said.
3 years years later, the pain is still raw for the Beavers family. Who murdered Missy?
The morning of April 18, 2016, if you would have told me that we would be in this parking lot talking about this case a year later, I would have thought you were out of your mind.
Earlier, Al, Lindsay, and I spoke with the reporter who has covered the case from the start. Take a look. We are joined by senior reporter Jason Whiteley from WFAA in Dallas, Texas. So, Jason, thank you so much for joining us. This April marks 4 years. So, I need to hear from you. What are police doing today to keep this case in the spotlight? I know that you've become an advocate, so thank you. And are there any new leads?
Yeah, you know, there's a lead here or there, but unfortunately it's not in the spotlight anymore. For all intents and purposes, this is a cold case. It's on the shelf, and that's remarkable because, you know, there are very specific clues. The person seen in the video at the church was wearing a police uniform, had a very unique walk with the right foot kind of, you know, swaying out there, kind of a duck walk as well, too. There was a Nissan sedan seen leaving the scene. There are specific clues, but, you know, law enforcement officers I've talked to said the only way they're going to solve this at this point, almost 4 years later, is if somebody comes forward and tells them what they know.
Well, Mr. Whiteley, let's continue to talk about somebody coming forward, because it seems like thousands of people came forward with tips, and at one point you guys even had a suspect. What can you tell us about him?
Yeah, you know, there were more than 2,000 tips that came forward, and a lot of the tips actually come forward for, you know, stories like this when we have conversations publicly about the case. There never was actually a suspect. There were people of interest. Police looked at Brandon Beavers, who was Missy's husband. They cleared him. They looked at Missy's father-in-law. They cleared him. They looked at several other people too and cleared them. You know, it's the person in this tactical gear. They're not even sure if that person is a man or a woman. At least they're not saying it publicly. So they haven't really narrowed down exactly who this is.
And you talked about Missy's husband being a suspect, and he's been cleared. So what does he think? Does he think this is a random attack, or does he think that his wife may have known the killer?
Yeah, you know, all along he said he did not think that she was targeted for any reason. He thought this was just a random attack. But, you know, police looked at this. The Texas Rangers, which is like the state police force, they looked at it as well. Other law enforcement agencies have looked at this. If it was a vandal in there trying to tear up the church, they didn't tear up a lot of things. A lot of things were left undisturbed. If it was a burglar, they didn't take anything else. So law enforcement's pretty clear that this was likely a targeted attack on her. They just haven't figured out exactly why. When they determine that, they might have a clearer path at exactly who may have done this.
And we hope and pray. I mean, Missy and her family deserves justice. So thank you, Jason, for updates. And to read more on this case, visit WFAA.com. We'll be right back. That wraps up night one of our True Crime Chronicles Marathon. Tune in tomorrow night for more. Thanks for watching.